Hey everyone, and thank you for attending. Today we'll be talking about something a little different, perhaps something other advisors are not quite comfortable talking about. We'll be covering the topic of AI, discussing potential use cases, risks, and most importantly, how our team here at Breakaway believes we can take advantage of this landscape for our clients. Before we jump into it, just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Pat Rufa, one of the partners here at Breakaway Wealth Management. I'm also joined by one of my other partners, Dave Kraus. A little bit of background on our team. We're a full service firm that focuses on holistic financial planning. We help families get organized across retirement planning, estate planning, and investment strategies. Over the years, we've helped many individuals and families navigate major life transitions by creating customized financial plans tailored to their unique goals. One of the areas, or one area that we often talk about with clients, specifically from an investment standpoint, is how can we take advantage of current themes in the market, right? How does our portfolio, or does our portfolio have the proper exposure? AI is absolutely a transformative technology, and we've brought in our partners from First Trust, Matt Straza and Andrew Hull, to help us kind of walk us through some key concepts as well as some trends for us to look out for. So I'll kick it off to Matt.
Thank you, Pat. Appreciate it. Thank you to the Breakaway team, Pat, Dave, and the rest of the team for having us on today. My name is Matt Straza. I cover Northern New Jersey and Westchester, New York for our firm. Our firm's based in Wheaton, Illinois, and we manage a little over $325 billion. A lot of what we do is come up with innovative ideas, products, ETFs, unit investment trusts. But alongside that is we have a lot of intellectual capital, intellectual horsepower, like you're about to see from our speaker, Andrew Hull, today. Andrew formerly was on our award-winning economist team. He is now vice president and ETF strategist for First Trust. And a lot of what he does as a specialty is a lot of the thematic ideas and satellite ideas as far as investing goes. A lot of those themes that have very low overlap to the S&P 500. So I know he's going to share a couple of different ideas, and I'm not going to take away too much thunder from Andrew. But Andrew, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to the Breakaway team for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you virtually, and as Matt said, sharing kind of some of our thoughts, our high level thoughts on AI specifically and the markets. And so I just want to thank you for joining today, and thanks to the Breakaway team for inviting us to be part of the call today. So there is a whole lot that we could talk about when it comes to AI, and so we're just going to kind of scratch the surface today in the next few minutes, just to kind of talk about the technology, what is the hype all about, and maybe one or two certainly use cases, but also some of those areas of opportunity for investors. So I've got a few slides to share. You should see those coming up here in a minute. As we look back at the market over the last few years, I know the last week or so has definitely been volatile. We've seen a little bit of a sell-off. But if we look back and think about the last really 3 years in the equity market, at least when we look at a broad index like the S&P 500, returns have been on the surface pretty solid, right? Last year, the S&P 500 was up 18%. The prior 2 calendar years, the market was up over 20%. So all in, the market's done very, very well the last 3 years. However, under the surface, what you'll see on the screen here is market breadth, right? So how many companies in that basket of 500 that we call the S&P 500, how many of them are actually participating, or how many have actually been able to beat the overall index the last three years? What you'll see, I have it on my screen over here, and hopefully you can see that on yours. But as you look at the last 3 years, really what you'll notice is the last three have been the most narrow years we've seen in at least the last 3 decades, right? Even compared to 98, 99, which was the height of the dot-com bubble at that time. Many of you probably remember that, and the excitement, the exuberance in markets, but they were very narrow. If we look at the last three, though, there actually have been even more narrow, meaning fewer companies today have participated to the upside, even compared to a time like then. And the reason for that is this group of companies called the Magnificent Seven. Many of you have probably heard that phrase. Certainly, you're probably all familiar with those stocks. You can see the tickers here on the bottom of the screen. But these are the really kind of the market leaders the last 3 years. These are companies like NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA, the largest company in the United States, about a $4 trillion market cap. And they are the world's leading designer of AI chips. They're called graphic processing units. They don't manufacture them, but they design and sell them. And so NVIDIA has become the largest company in the S&P 500 the last couple of years. And then you look on down the list, companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, right? All of those companies are really the perceived leaders in artificial intelligence, right? They're implementing, they're training and integrating these large language models into all of their products, right? If you use Microsoft Office, you now have this AI copilot that sits there and helps you complete tasks. If you use Google Search, for example, or Google Maps, right? Really any Google product, or you have an Android phone, you know that AI called Gemini is integrated into all of those products and platforms, right? And so as we step back and look at the market, it's been very narrow. And really, these market leaders, the ones that have been able to outperform the overall index for the most part, this group of Mag 7 stocks are some of the perceived leaders when it comes to artificial intelligence. And as we look at the concentration today in the market, these companies have risen to become just gigantic. I mentioned NVIDIA is now 4 trillion. It was actually over $5 trillion market cap company not that long ago. But these companies are 2, 3, $4 trillion in size to where today they actually dwarf entire sectors, right? So this group of 7 companies is actually, if they were a standalone sector in the S&P 500, they'd be the largest sector, right? In fact, a company like NVIDIA is larger than the entire materials sector, right? 2 companies, if you had Apple and NVIDIA, they'd be larger than even the financials sector, right? Or consumer staples sector, right? It's truly phenomenal how they've risen to prominence and to really dominate a lot of the market indices. And again, I think that just goes to show just how important this AI story is, not just for the technology itself, but also how it's impacted markets over the last few years. So let me kind of dive into this technology and what all the hype is about. Many of you probably are well aware of what's going on in artificial intelligence. Maybe you're using some of these tools on a daily basis, but some of you might not. So I'm going to keep it relatively high level on what the hype is all about and this excitement, and really what is the breakthrough that has gotten everybody so excited. So as we look, there is a lot of excitement, as you can tell on the screen. Headlines. I mean, every time you turn on CNBC or Bloomberg Media, your financial news source of choice, they are talking about AI. It's really inescapable for investors. And so, as we kind of look at markets today, I think it's important to kind of define terms, right? What are we actually talking about when we're talking about AI, right? So AI, from a broad sense, it's just a discipline, right? It's a branch within computer science, just like physics is a branch of traditional science. AI is a branch within computer science. It's actually been around for a long time. The term actually goes all the way back to the 1950s. But really, it's any technology that allows computers or machines to mimic human intelligence. Okay, that's kind of the broad working definition. Any technology that allows computers and machines to mimic human intelligence. So anything that allows them to act autonomously or to reason or learn or analyze and interpret vast amounts of data. And AI, like I said, has been around for a long time. We actually use it maybe more than we think. So if you think about Google Maps or Apple Maps, for example, whatever software you like to use for your phone, you put in a destination on your app where you want to go, and it's using real-time information it's collecting from other drivers or from news or media on construction delays, on traffic congestion, and really it comes up with the best route for you and makes that decision autonomously, right? There's nobody on the other side of the app that's looking at where you want to go and what your location is and giving you the best route, right? That's in some ways it's artificial intelligence working behind the scenes. That's a little bit different, though, than what has come about today. And so Steve Jobs famously, back in 1985, he really envisioned the breakthrough that we've more recently that's happened in artificial intelligence the last few years. He said, and there's a speech, you can pull it up on YouTube. He talked to, I believe he was traveling in Europe, and what he said was during, the part of this speech he gave is that someday some student will not only be able to read the words that Aristotle wrote, but ask Aristotle a question and get an answer, right? And that is the world that we live in today with what we call generative AI. So there's lots of different forms of artificial intelligence out there. There's machine learning and deep learning and things like that. There's many different sort of tiers of artificial intelligence. What's new today, really over the last 3 or 4 years, it's really come into the public consciousness, is what we call generative AI, right? And as you can see, generative AI is a form of machine learning that falls within that larger umbrella of artificial intelligence. But generative AI is really the breakthrough. And generative AI is essentially the breakthrough here is that computers are able to understand natural human language, right? If you think about the history of computing over the last, 60, 70, 80 years, there's always been a bit of a disconnect between computers and humans, because to really speak to a computer or to program, you had to learn to code. You had to learn the language of computing, right? You had to learn to be a programmer. And so today, with this generative AI breakthrough, essentially these new models have been trained on huge swaths of the internet. So you think of, billions and billions of pages of data, right? All of Wikipedia, all of social media, huge, for Reddit, for example, is used in training these models. Billions and billions of different posts from people over the years. These models, paired with these new generation of chips that are able to compute very, very quickly, are essentially able to understand human language. They're basically big prediction machines that have been trained on so much natural human language that it's essentially like they understand it and can communicate back to us in our natural human language. Okay, so that's really kind of the breakthrough with what we call large language models. And there's all kinds of different types of models. So most of us are probably familiar with ChatGPT. ChatGPT was an app that was launched at the end of 2022, and that's a text-to-text model, right? So, and this is really the app that really brought this new technology to the public consciousness. So it launched at the end of 2022, and you can see on the screen how quickly it reached its first million users, right? Back then, it took just 5 days for a million people to sign up and start using this new large language model. And that compares to some of the other apps that we know and love and use on a daily basis. Twitter, for example, took 2 years to reach its first million users. Facebook, it took 10 months. Instagram, it took 2.5 months. So for this to reach its first million users in just 5 days is really staggering. And today, there's something like 200 million users that use ChatGPT, and it fields something like 2 billion prompts every single day. So the adoption of this technology has really been amazing. But for the most part, most people are using what are called text-to-text models, right? So using this technology, you input a prompt or a question, and you get an answer back in text, right? You type it in, and it responds with text. That's how most people are using these models. But there's other types of generative AI models too. So there's text-to-image models as well. GPT and Grok and some of these other models, they're implementing these text-to-image models right alongside the traditional text-to-text models too. So many of them, for example, maybe you need to generate an image for whatever reason for maybe your kid or your grandkid or something. They need a new logo for their soccer team, right? So instead of hiring a graphic designer or Googling around and trying to find one that makes sense, you're able to just simply input a text prompt, say, I'd like to generate an image of a soccer team, right? Whatever the town is, and it's their logo is the Bears or something, or their logo is the Sparks or something like that, the Stars. And so you're able to get an image back really instantaneously and for free, right? So those are text to image models. There's text to video models. The list kind of goes on and on. But one of the things that's amazing is some of these video models, for example, that might be where the future of entertainment goes, right? So instead of sitting down on your couch and thumbing through Netflix to try to find something that looks interesting, maybe one day you'll be able to put in a prompt or speak a prompt of something you'd like to watch, and a generative AI model behind the scenes will actually generate a video. So maybe generate a TV show, a movie, a mini series on exactly what you want to watch. If it's something in the Wild West, 150 years ago, or it's something in the future set on another planet, you're able to decide that and watch something that's interesting and compelling that is totally brand new, right? And so that's where this technology is kind of going. So that's the generative AI breakthrough. And there's a lot of different types of use cases, right? There are millions of different use cases. We can't even begin to scratch the surface with how these are being used. But it can be as simple as writing an email for you, or writing a piece of marketing material if you're a small business to send to clients. In the legal field, a lot of white collar jobs are, those that have mundane, repetitive tasks are already being disrupted by these generative AI models. Just the other day, there was a model that was released specifically to be used in the legal field to generate legal documents and to read through legal briefs and come up, read through case law and things like that, and make the legal field much more efficient. That was just released just the other day. So we're seeing huge amounts of innovation when it comes to sort of writing, right? Because that's what these models are good at. They're good at understanding natural human language and putting that down on paper. In something like healthcare, there is a ton of disruption that we're already seeing, especially when it comes to developing new drugs, for example. One of the things that these models are really good at is analyzing and interpreting huge amounts of data, right? So if you have a clinical trial of some kind, maybe it's a new drug that's being developed and you have thousands of patients with, thousands and thousands of different health variables and health history and, genetic differences and things like that. Being able to understand, interpret, and find patterns in that data has already been used in the biotech field, for example, to generate new drugs and try to get them to market much more quickly. I already mentioned kind of art and graphic design, entertainment. One of the things that's interesting on the top left, there's something called AI agents. And this is really what's coming next, is where you might have a job and you have many different tasks you use on the computer and you're working across different programs and platforms. Well, you might have essentially your own stand-up workforce that does those tasks for you, right? So you might one day be able to have an AI agent that's specifically designed to read your emails that come into your inbox, draft responses, and have those waiting for you, right? When maybe before you even wake up, right? While you're at lunch, maybe it's working on that. So when you get back to your computer, you can review and send out those emails. The CEO of Microsoft has talked about that, how he can't wait for that because he spends so much time first thing in the morning going through his emails. And obviously somebody like that, their time is valuable. And so having something that can reply, that is able to look across, maybe look at his calendar or look at other information out there on the network to come up with a reply for him, that's a huge productivity boost. So there are all kinds of ways that this new technology is already being implemented. Now, obviously, there's a lot of risks too. And I don't pretend to have all the answers of how we solve some of the concerns and risks with this type of technology. But one of the concerns out there is definitely over jobs, right? If you look at the job market today, a lot of the pundits and economists are talking about how it's a no hire, no fire scenario where we're not seeing a huge amount of firing. If you look at something like initial weekly unemployment claims, they're relatively stable. However, we're also not seeing a lot of job hiring, new jobs being created as well too. So there is definitely concern that as we go forward, this technology is going to displace a lot of people, especially those that have maybe those clerical, mundane sort of white collar jobs that could be automated relatively easily, right? We're already seeing some disruption there. There's also concerns about privacy, right? Where does this information go if you upload it to one of these large language models, right? Best practice is to never put anything confidential or sensitive into these models, right? It's just something certainly we don't do in the finance industry and wouldn't recommend you do in any other field as well. But the question is, where does that information go? How is it being used? And so that's definitely a concern as well. One of the things we've seen too is issues with accuracy as well as bias. So if you've experimented with some of these models, you might have found that sometimes they can give incorrect answers, right? So it's always best to trust but verify, right, as the saying goes, and also double check the sources. So you can ask it, prompt it, can you give me a source on this information you gave me, and go double check it yourself, because these models, as good as they are, they're not trained on every piece of information, right? So there are certain things that they don't know, and oftentimes they actually make things up. It's called hallucinations. And then finally, bias. We've seen this. At the end of the day, these models are trained on specific information that's input by humans, right? And so there can be bias. The parameters that are set for these models, what's inbounds and what's out of bounds to say or to do, is set by humans, right? And so inherently there can be bias with these models as well too. Finally, education. Many of you have kids or grandchildren that are, at school, growing up in this world where these powerful tools are available in their pocket, right? Think about the most sophisticated, smartest brain that, if you combine Einstein and the equivalent from every field of study or industry that's ever existed, and you combine it into one brain, that's kind of what AI is. And so how do we train students in a world like this where these tools are available? And so one of the things too that Steve Jobs, he mentioned in that speech, he said that whenever we develop a new medium, we generally tend to fall back to our old habits from our old media. And so that's very much the case with these models too. And the example he went on to give is, first when we had television, right? Way back, however long that was, maybe 80 years ago when TV came about, the first shows were really just a camera pointed at a radio show, right? It took us a long time to figure out, okay, we could do full-length movies, and we can do sitcoms, and we can do, all these other things, live sports and things like that. It took us a long time to figure out this new medium. Same thing with the internet, right? The first web pages were really just a newspaper that was reposted as a web page. It took us a long time to figure out things like social media, streaming services, and things like that. Same thing with AI. We're, in my opinion, we're still in the early stages of this technology, and all of us have to figure out how to use it, right? If you try to use it like a traditional Google search, just looking for information, it might not be the best, right? It's probably going to be underwhelming, right? That's one way to say it. But if you use it maybe to come up with a new nutrition plan or a new workout plan, or maybe a travel itinerary, and let it go, give it more detail with your prompt, it's amazing the type of results that you can get. So all that being said, this is fascinating technology. It's really changed, I think, market dynamics over the last few years. And again, we think there's a long sort of runway for growth. Couple more just brief comments. I mentioned, at the onset, I mentioned one or two areas of opportunity we think are interesting for investors to consider given this AI boom, right? So that's setting aside kind of the technology and some of the use cases I just talked about. For investors, where are potential opportunities? And if we look at the big tech companies, right? So those magnificent seven companies that I mentioned at the onset, how are they spending their money, and where are some of the beneficiaries? Well, we think companies involved in energy production and power and actually grid infrastructure are some of those maybe areas of opportunity for investors to consider. And just looking at this chart here on the screen, everybody is every single quarter very focused on how much those big AI companies are spending, right? Because they're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on chips and data centers every single year. And just yesterday, we had Google report their earnings, for example. And everybody, again, was hyper focused on their capital expenditure plans. And they essentially announced they're going to double how much money they spent this year compared to last year. But in total, you can see on the screen there, as far as we can tell, and this is as of the end of the year, these numbers have already gone up for this coming year. Companies are going to be spending over $500 billion on AI capex. It is truly staggering. And I think that number is actually over $600 billion. Just in the last 6 weeks, it's jumped that much. But the numbers are truly staggering. And that money is going into chips and it's going into data centers and everything related to that, right? So roughly 60% of the cost of a new data center is in particular going into chips, right? Primarily from companies like NVIDIA, for example. They have the lion's share of the market when it comes to these chips. But behind the scenes, these models actually use, these AI models, they use a ton of processing power and they actually use a massive amount of electricity, right? And so again, those companies involved in those areas have done very well, but we expect them to continue to benefit from these trends. You can see just how much power each successive generation of NVIDIA chip is using, right? So a couple of years ago, the prior generation used something like 700 watts per chip. The newest generation, which is called the Rubin chip, might use something like 2,000 watts of power when it's doing something like training one of these AI models. And just to put that in perspective, 2,000 watts is roughly equivalent to some of the largest appliances you might have in your house, right? So think about your dishwasher, your washer dryer, maybe your oven if it's cranked up on full blast, right? That's going to draw about 2,000 watts. And so one of these chips is going to draw about the same amount when it's being used to its fullest potential, right? So the other thing we're seeing too, you can see on the right there, is that there are more and more of these chips. Millions of these chips are being shipped, put into data centers, and connected to the grid every single year. And what they've found is the more chips that they can put together, these AI chips, into a cluster, the better their actual training results are, and the more efficient that training is. And so you can see just a few years ago, these GPU clusters, these chip clusters, or maybe only 10 or 15,000 of these chips. Today, the biggest ones are hundreds of thousands of these chips, right? So when you think about hundreds of thousands of ovens or washer dryers all plugged in and running at the same time, you start to realize how much of a strain that is on the power grid. If you look at some of the size of these data centers, so the latest numbers that I've seen are there's something like 3,000 data centers here in the US that are either under construction or are planned in the coming years. And that is far and away the most of anywhere in the world. We have the lion's share of data centers across the world here in the US. But not only are there more data centers, this new generation of data center is completely different than prior generations of the last 15 or 20 years. Certainly the size of them is growing because, again, there's more chips being packed in the same data center. And so when you look at the power draw of some of the data centers that are coming online, it's truly staggering. I mean, just in the next few years, really, I think this year, in the coming months, there are several data centers that are over 1 gigawatt in size, right? You can see the different projects there across the country. I think 8 out of 9 of them listed here are in the United States. But then you compare those red lines there, to the average power draw of some huge cities across the world. The city of Los Angeles, on average, draws about 2.5 gigawatts of power. And some of these data centers are actually approaching that when it comes to their capacity. Now, city of Los Angeles, it obviously fluctuates a lot. In the summertime, it actually goes way above that. But some of these data centers, nonetheless, are approaching the average power draw of a large city like that. And not all of them are this big. Some of them, most of them, are less than a gigawatt in size. But this has huge implications for the power grid. And so companies involved in building out the power grid as well as generating energy behind the scenes, we think are some of the primary beneficiaries of all of this AI growth. Most investors have definitely been focused on the chips, right? The NVIDIAs and some of those other big chip companies and some of the manufacturers done very, very well. But we think this is just one other area of opportunity because the power draw is so tremendous. And again, this isn't really an industry. When we look at power draw and the numbers today compared to prior decades, this is an industry. Utilities and some of the big transmission companies that are sort of regional across the U.S. They haven't seen these numbers, this growth in baseload energy demand in decades, right? So by 2030, you can see there they're expecting roughly 6%, 5.5 to 6% growth in the coming years. They really haven't seen this type of base load energy demand growth since the 1960s, right? So we're talking multi decades highs when it comes to the growth rates for energy. So again, we think those companies involved in grid infrastructure and power generation, I think, really could benefit. One final thing I'll mention too, another industry certainly impacted by AI is cybersecurity. What we're seeing is criminals or hackers, they're actually using these AI tools to look for vulnerabilities, right? To target high net worth individuals and scrape the internet for information on them to generate specific personalized attacks for them, right? And so that just goes to show cybersecurity is more important than ever, right? Because criminals are again they're scraping the internet, they're targeting individuals the attacks they're using are much more sophisticated, and they're even impersonating individuals. So I mentioned some of the tools these AI models are audio or their video models. They're actually using those to essentially do what are called these deep fake attacks, where they generate an AI message that might sound like an individual. Maybe it's a family member of yours to specifically try to scam individuals out of money, right? They might send a message that sounds like a family member that needs help or needs money in some capacity. And we've seen these types of attacks. So I think that just goes to show cybersecurity is more important than ever in one of those industries, just like grid and power, that might benefit from the advent of this new technology. So with that, I will wrap up my comments there, but I would be happy to take any questions if there are any.
So we ask if any of the attendees, if you have any questions, I believe there is a way for you to kind of raise your hand um, on here, and then we can kind of open up the dialogue if there are any questions, of course. All right, doesn't seem like we have any questions, Andrew, but this was awesome, really informative, and appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk us through this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So again, if we'll be reaching out to the participants after the call, but if you have any questions on AI and how our team is incorporating this in portfolios for our clients, feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to discuss kind of our strategies with you as well. So with that being said, everyone have a good one.